Hello, welcome back to another edition of NFA segment here at Whale, where we discuss different investing aspects, quote unquote, of the NFT space. As the name suggests, this is not financial advice. There's absolutely no substitute for doing your own research. For those of you new to the community, I'm your host, Ilus Gavia, and I am a recovering TradFi professional. I have a background in capital markets where I spent more than 15 years. In today's edition of NFA, we welcome back Phoenix, a thought leader on asymmetric strategy theory, as we discuss the OODA loop today, a tool for uncertain markets. And given what's going on, I think this is pretty timely. Phoenix, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Oh, thanks for joining. With everything going on today, I thought that it's pretty timely that we're introducing the community to the OODA loop, which, as I like to kind of think about, it's a mental and decision-making framework. And personally, I found it pretty invaluable since I first came to hear about it. So Phoenix, could you provide a quick overview of what it is, at least in the simplest terms from your perspective, something that might help the community kind of get their bearings, as it were?
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. And I would tell you at the highest level, the simplest thing to do as you're delving into the topic of OODA loop is to Google it, download the graphic, which you have depicted on the screen, and begin independent research. I have to tell you that I've been at this for approaching 30 years of studying these theories, applying them in graduate academic work. I'm also a refugee of the traditional finance space, as you know, and this is by far and away one of the most valuable things that I've ever learned in my life. And I hope that everybody will find the interest in exploring it further, because here's the disclaimer. You're subject to this whether you...
Phoenix, can you hold on a second? It seems that the restream is not working. Just 1 second, please.
Okay.
Let's see why that's not working. Let's try and troubleshoot that quickly. Bear with me 1 moment. Well, I'm not sure what's going on, but let's keep going. So at the highest level, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, at the highest level, it's basically the axiom of like how humans observe, orient, decide, and act. It's what we're constantly all doing. The person who discovered it and formulated it in the graphic that you see was a guy by the name of John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot in the Air Force who became a scholar / strategist. And he basically, what he stumbled across in his research, I think, is a discovery of how we interact with our world. In other words, how does our internal operating system, how does it function as we continue to deal with chaos and the like? So when we're up against chaotic environments that are constantly changing, like capital markets, like the crypto space, like we're seeing right now unfold in the geopolitical situation, we have to understand how our observations are shaped and how our decisions and actions will in turn be formulated.
Okay, so it's really a decision-making framework, and you mentioned that it was sort of like the brainchild of an individual named John Boyd. Could you give a little bit of sort of like a background as to who he was and how he came to create this?
Yeah, absolutely. So he originally had started his explorations into air-to-air fighter combat. He was a fighter pilot who started to ask the questions, what's really making the victor in a dogfight successful? Is it the technology? Is it the engineering? Or is it the person inside the cockpit? And what he came up with, I think, is really it's a combination of all of those things, but inherently the most important thing, or not inherently, but explicitly the most important thing, was the person in the cockpit and how fast that they could cycle through observations, decisions, and actions versus a competitor. So in other words, whoever could make decisions and actions the fastest was the one who was going to prevail in combat.
Okay, so it's in essence whoever has the fastest throughput of basically taking the inputs, making a decision, and kind of like reacting to it. But it's not just that simplistic. It's as the graphic that I have up on the screen shows, it has 4 distinct steps: observe, orient, decide, act, which are in and of itself where the OODA in the OODA loop comes from. But
Correct.
can you walk through at least how you've experienced this and how this has helped you in your career as you kind of step through these 4 steps? And if I'm looking at the graph, or the first time I looked at it, I didn't really appreciate exactly how nuanced it was, but Orient has a graph within a graph. So I think we should spend a little bit of time delving into that.
Yes. Well, let me put it in the easiest possible terms first that we all can understand, since we're all right now using an operating system. Think of the blue part, the orientation, as the internal operating system of a human being, of a decision maker, of an observer, someone that's going to, us, right? And what we're trying to do is keep that blue part updated and matched to reality as it really is. Not as we imagine it, not as we hope it to be, but as it actually is. And the more aligned we can keep that particular model aligned with reality, you see the parts where it says implicit guidance and control. These are the 2 most important parts after the blue part, after the orientation. Our orientation has a direct effect on how we process what we see. So if that orientation, if in other words, that internal operating system of the human being is aligned with the unfolding circumstances as it actually is, as they continue to interact with their own environment, the more aligned with reality that is, the more effectively they'll be able to see and figure out what's going on. And then you see that our orientation also shapes or implicitly guides and controls how we act. So
would you say that orientation is more like the lens through which we view the observation? Because when you made the point that observation is trying to see the world where it is, not where we would like it to be.
Yeah.
Wouldn't orientation be almost the filter through which we actually wind up doing the observation?
Yeah, that's a fair description, I would say. I mean, orientation is the internal process of a human that is going to shape what they see, how they decide, and how they act. So we could say, well, that's the lens that we view the world through, or that's the system that we process our decisions, our actions, and then of course it's a loop, it's a feedback loop, how we process our learning. And the reality is the more that we keep that match to reality, the more that we open ourselves up to the fact that we could be wrong about things. We might not have accurate data. The more that we keep that system updated, if you will, that internal operating system updated, the more effectively we could observe quicker, and then we could act faster, because ultimately the advantage that we're trying to gain is time. When you look at the loop and you see it go forward from observation to act, that's all occurring in time and space. And the theory goes, and this is what John Boyd was, I think this is really where the power of OODA unlocks, is that the more matched to reality, the more aligned with reality our orientation is, our internal operator system, our lens, our filter, whatever we want to call it, the more aligned with reality that is, the more effective and the faster we'll be able to figure out what's going on and act on those decisions. So we'll be able to cycle through those processes faster than our opponent, than the weather, than our rate of change, whatever it is that we're up against. In other words, it's applicable to any type of conflict. And pretty much everything we're doing is some form of conflict.
Okay, so that actually kind of falls into what I was about to ask you, that given that the origins is the military, given that Boyd was a fighter pilot, and it definitely seems to have like that armed conflict perspective. To me, I the way I view it is definitely it's conflict, but it's whenever there's uncertainty, because if it's like man, man versus machine, man versus nature, it's not necessarily has to be armed conflict. So given that it definitely seems to be a way to deal with the uncertainty of the unknown, how have you applied this to not just your career, but your life? And then, given what we're seeing in the markets today, with the situation between Russia and Ukraine, and the spillover into different markets, how would you frame this for the listener? How this applies in these sort of situations?
Great question. So, without coming down on any particular side, I would offer this first. I would say that everything that we read, study, learn, watch via social media, via our devices, any type of news, all of that is being filtered into our orientation. All of that is having an effect on our orientation, voluntarily or involuntarily, right? So, this morning, my kids and I were looking at the news and we're seeing what's going on in the world. And I'm talking to friends that live in Europe and getting their perspective, right? So we're automatically seeking information to update our own personal orientation in an effort to try to understand what's going on, not mere knowledge, but understanding. So knowing that, I make that distinction because anything I've been consuming on Twitter all day about the situation geopolitically currently, everything that I'm consuming is part of my orientation update, and it's having an effect on how I observe, voluntarily or involuntarily, right? So if I only gain one perspective, let's just say, for an example, I mean, I don't want to pick on any one particular outlet, but just to say CNN. If I'm getting all my information from CNN, that's a massive part of my orientation. And you see that bottom left corner, that's new information. And my information only comes from CNN. My operating system will be guided and controlled to observe in alignment with whatever it was that I was consuming, right? If I only had one perspective, if I had multiple perspectives, all of that is going to shape how I see things. So when I look today at what was going on, in fact, I'm a very early riser, and I wake up at 4 and I start reading, but I noticed there's like a slew of texts waiting for me from friends in Europe and saying things like, "Oh, World War III started. Oh, it's like 1940 all over again," or whatever. I'm seeing that everybody's coming from a perspective unique to their own orientation. But as I update that into my own, I'm seeking to understand what's actually going on. So as I continue to observe the unfolding circumstances and receive outside information, right, I'm trying my hardest to filter all of that out to make sure that it's aligned with reality, and I'm not just buying into some narratives, in order to keep my decision process and my action process and my learning process in order to keep it lined up with reality, right?
So when you say that you're trying to have a broad, let's call it, throughput of input,
yeah,
given that, let's call it, disinformation campaigns and fake news and propaganda are probably caught up in here somewhere, how
yeah.
are you kind of filtering for that in order to not malign, rather, not to bias your orientation due to someone's manipulation? And also, how do you sort of establish a process whereby you're constantly bringing in that diverse viewpoint? Because I get the point that if you're only looking at, let's say, CNN, the example you used, you're getting CNN's viewpoint and editorialized view, irrespective of whether or not it's an opinion piece, given the language used by writers tend to at least coalesce around a certain sort of style within each organization. But if we were to take the totality of media in, let's say, the US, you're still excluding a viewpoint from, let's say, Western or Eastern Europe or Africa or Asia. So how are you sort of guarding against that sort of unilateral view?
I think that my observations improve the more perspectives I get, and taking things to their opposite is a great way to, in other words, I think it's the Hegelian dialect, right? I'm given a thesis, and I'm going to assume the antithesis so that I can come up with the synthesis or the synthesis, right? So that I'm given the thesis, I'll take the antithesis, and I'll try to find the synthesis between the two. Somewhere between the two extremes might lie the truth, or not necessarily the truth, but actionable information that's going to be more effective for me.
But still, so if someone that's new to this process or has only
Yeah.
ever been or has only ever really experienced, let's call it media from one sort of source or
Yeah.
cultural background.
Let me answer it another way. So if you go online and you type in the cognitive bias codex, there's 188 biases that reside inside of our brains, which in the case of OODA, all of our biases reside inside of our orientation. What John Boyd was telling us was that we have to smash those models. We have to be willing to break those models, that we don't know everything, because we can never have complete, perfect information. Uncertainty is a constant, and it's impossible to fix two things. If I know one position, the likelihood that I would be able to fix another one with accuracy is unlikely. That's Heisenberg. And then also entropy, right? So if I close my system, if I close my thinking system, if I close my orientation, and I am not aware of my own biases, and I'm not aware of how I'm getting my information, and I'm only looking at things in one perspective, that's what's ultimately going to lead to my loop, my OODA loop, crashing. Because as Mark Twain said, it's not going to be what I don't know that gets me into trouble. It's the things that I'm absolutely positive that turn out not to be true, because I was unwilling to smash my models. I was unwilling to have a dynamic open stance, which would allow for different contingencies than the ones that I'm certain of, right? Does that help? Does that make sense? So when I look at news as an example, and like say a geopolitical situation like that's unfolding, right? I have to be willing to be open-minded about all of that. And I have to be willing to smash the models and update them if they need to be, because I may not know exactly what's going on. I'm not there. I'm never going to have complete information. So I have to believe that any opinion I form, regardless of how strong it is, I have to keep it loose, and I have to keep it open and flexible to something that could change. If I don't do that, then I'm going to have a very hard time not only cycling through that loop, but adapting.
So how do you deal with, so what I was driving toward, and one of our community members kind of pointed out as well, is how do you control for the fact that if we're here sitting here speaking in English and consuming news media in English, that's already colored by a cultural context inherent in the language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if we were consuming it in, let's say, Spanish or French or Russian or Chinese, we'd have a different cultural context embedded in it.
Yes.
And as non-speakers of those other languages, how do we sort of try and bring in those perspectives in order to enhance our OODA loops?
That's a great question. I mean, it continues to hit on the thing that I have to understand, that cultural traditions, which are depicted on orientation, are going to have an effect on how I see things. And there's going to be a difference in how I see things in the United States or how I see things from Croatia or Turkey or anywhere else, right? I have to account for that. I have to accept that people are different. Orientation is different, both at the individual level and at the cultural level and everything in between. So I would want to have as many perspectives as I could to try to understand, again, collect as many theses as I could to take the correct antithesis to find the synthesis there, because there's probably I don't know if I'm answering the way you'd like, but it's basically like I have to be open to that reality that people are going to see things uniquely, because everybody's orientation is unique to them, and everybody's cultural orientation is not necessarily the same.
No, that's definitely fair. But if we're spending so much time trying to disambiguate the signal from the noise, and we're trying to figure out the best inputs for what we're doing, we're trying to get all this accuracy information, what's the risk that we're basically get stuck in the observation point of the loop? Because if the whole premise is that the person or the entity with the fastest OODA loop will win the conflict, how do we get past the orientation stage at that point in order to have an effective OODA loop in uncertainty? Because at the end of the day, having perfect information is nearly impossible.
Just don't forget, it's not necessarily speed through the loop. It's having the orientation that's matched to reality as it speeds through the loop. And that's
So can you break that down a little bit more for people that are not as familiar with the OODA loop? Can you break that down in a slightly more digestible fashion? Because that's a critical point that I don't want to get lost.
Yeah. Again, the operating system, right? All technology mimics nature. Let's just use the analogy of the operating system that's inside the computer you're hearing me on, or the smartphone or the iPad or whatever. Every operating system is shaped by what it's updated and receives as inputs, and it has to constantly be updated to new realities. Because if you didn't update your operating system, what would happen? You'd be subject to threats, viruses, obsolescence. Maybe certain things aren't going to function properly. Well, the mind is the same way, right? The human orientation is the same way. If I'm not updating it, if I'm not seeking out every possible update that I can get my hands on, I'm not going to have an orientation that's aligned with reality. And no matter how fast I cycle through that loop, I'm going to be diverged from reality. There's going to be a massive divergent aspect of an orientation that's not functioning through the world as it is. That's where we become deluded. We become jaded by bias. An easy example would be, say, Blockbuster and Netflix, right? Blockbuster saw itself as a retail experience, and they could cycle through their loop from that orientation fast. But Netflix, who saw themselves as the get movies into the home faster company, they're able to cycle through even faster and ultimately outpace Blockbuster by cycling their own loop through their time cycle. In other words, they were inside of Blockbuster's decision cycle because their orientation was more aligned with reality of what people wanted or what people would be more receptive to versus what Blockbuster was selling. Does that help paint the picture?
I think so, but I'll also leave it to the community to chime in if they want more precision or clarity. So,
But let me remind everybody, because all information is always incomplete, and because uncertainty is a constant, you're never going to have perfect information. So the more flexible and dynamic you are, the more open that you are to change, the more that we're able to admit that we don't have it 100% right all the time, and we're constantly seeking to revise and update that model. That's how we stay effective. There's no perfect information, and what you're hitting on is exactly what people need to do. I need to say that there's other perspectives about this set of facts that I need to try to understand, because if I narrowly focus it through my own cultural lens or my own cognitive biases, I may not be aligned with reality, and that's going to have a negative effect on my continuous cycle of observation, orientation, decision, action as I go forward.
So I guess let's take it from the abstract a little and make it a little bit more concrete. So how have you applied this in your career to make you more effective, whether as a professional, a leader, or even in your personal life? And just given the construct of how this kind of has helped you, I think that might help the community understand how you take this quote unquote abstract concept and apply it more tangibly.
Well, I'll go back to John Boyd. So when he was originally working this stuff out, when he was studying air-to-air combat, he realized it all comes down to people. So how it's helped me is understand that people always have to come first, because any organization, any team, any group is a group of individuals. It's a group of people with their own individual orientations that are made up from, any number of different backgrounds. But it's really helped me understand that people always have to be the focus. Now, Boyd's mandate, if you will, to us, or his parting wisdom was people, ideas, things, always in that order. If you're focused on hardware or software, even, or any kind of thing, or ideas are great, but if you don't understand the perspective of what it would mean to a person, then you're going to fail at some point. At some point, your cycle's going to crash, and it's not going to be you're not going to get the results that you want. The cohesion's going to break down. Trust is going to break down. However, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody to gain their perspective, I'm probably going to be better off in the long run than simply focusing on ideas and things. People always have to come first. So that's what, when you ask me like what's been successful with me, it's always been realigning, whether it's in leadership, whether it's investing or other things. It's always aligning that people have to come first, and the things that they do or don't understand, that's where the opportunity is to influence them, to align their orientations with whatever it is that you're trying to lead them through or help them out with.
And so let's extrapolate that. If it's about understanding the individual, when we're talking about broad collective, like broad crowds, let's call it large crowds of people acting in concert, or at least not necessarily in concert, but at least in the same venue, financial markets or crypto markets, you have large number of actors, all of these with all their different viewpoints and orientations. How do you apply OODA loop to financial or crypto markets, given that it is such a broad group of individuals with so many different perspectives? And how do you think about applying this in those frames?
Yeah, I understand it's going to be orientation versus X, right? And X could be another competitor. It could be the market, the rate of change. It could be my current balance sheet that I want to increase or whatever, but I'm in conflict with that. I'm trying to improve that. And I have to be matched to that specific idea. I have to be able to be free and independent of any kind of a collective narrative or any sort of news or whatever that's going to jade my decision-making process, that's going to have a negative adverse effect on my observation process, right? If I keep my orientation updated, I'm scanning and identifying mismatches. If I'm doing this effectively, I'm scanning and identifying mismatches and gaps faster than competitors, faster than the masses, faster than the average investor, whatever. So like you brought up a couple different examples, like say crypto. I have to be mindful of my understanding of crypto. It shapes my observations differently than someone who's ignorant of crypto or anti-crypto, etc. I have to have the ability to be comfortable with the discomfort of being different than everybody else when I see opportunities or I see gaps that others don't. I'm going to be I might be in a very unpopular place. I might be going against the herd. I might be going against the crowd. But if I'm a good investor, that's exactly what I want to look for. I want to look for those exact opportunities that are differentiated from what everybody else is doing.
So in essence, it's about being comfortable being uncomfortable,
Yes.
not fearing the unknown, and using this as the mechanism that allows you to do both.
Where plant the seeds of comfort grows the garden of complacency. And when you're frolicking in the garden of complacency, that's when we become the most vulnerable. That's when we become we have a degraded situational awareness, where we become blind to things. We become accustomed to things. We accept a certain reality that might not be matched with reality as it actually is, because someone else is going to look at the same facts and come up with a completely different conclusion. You use the word uncertainty, and I've used it a few times now in this conversation. Another one we want to bring out is ambiguity, and John Boyd was all about ambiguity and all about things being interpreted differently by different people, different orientations, different teams, different firms, whatever. things are subject to interpretation differently. Look at exactly what's going on. I mean, you brought up the example of the geopolitical situation, right? That same set of facts is being interpreted from many different perspectives, right? Just of the nature of ambiguity. Well, that's one of the things that we have to take into account, that someone's going to look at the same set of facts, or I might look at the same set of facts and come up with a completely different conclusion. In other words, some investors are thinking crisis, go to cash, or moving everything to gold, and other investors are looking at the same set of facts and coming up with a completely different conclusion, saying, well, this is a massive opportunity, or this is going to be great. This kind of chaos is exactly what I wanted. I've been trying to short the market for years, or whatever it could be. But this overall suggestion would be that there's a different orientation looking at the same set of facts, coming up with a completely different conclusion due to the constant nature of ambiguity, the constant existence of ambiguity.
So let's zoom back out to John Boyd for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So how did a U.S. Air Force pilot come up with this? Because this seems to incorporate various different elements from philosophy, psychology, behavioral analysis, a lot of different elements that are not necessarily the bailiwick of a pilot. So how did he come to basically put this out there?
Great question. I mean, I of all the various thinkers and strategists that I've studied, that I don't have to rely on ancient texts, that, of like someone recently, I can't think of a more autodidactic person, a more curious person, someone who violently challenged all assumptions, who believed nothing at face value, that put everything to the test. I can't think of anybody that's done more than John Boyd. I mean, if you read his biography by Robert Quorum, which I highly recommend, I've read it probably 10 times. It's just, you go through it and you just can't imagine the things that this guy did, and what he thought, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of books that he read, and the years that he spent quite monastically buried in this, as you say, combining so many different disciplines into one unified theory. Right before he died, the OODA loop was something that he talked about for years, but the graphic that you're showing, that was drawn in around, I think, 1995 or 1996, and he died in 1997. So, and that's the simplification of, 20 years being retired from the Air Force, and then 20 some years in the Air Force, constantly pulling and asking these questions. Constantly asking why, constantly trying to figure out what was behind it all, and how do I simplify all of that work into something like the OODA loop. I think you have linked his only published work on this was Destruction and Creation. It's a 11-page.
Not even, it's 8 pages.
Pages.
It's one of the densest PDFs I have ever read in my entire life.
And that's not an accident. So that's 4 years of monastic work simplified to 8 pages that he revised several times. And to your point, it's not, you think, oh, it's only 8 pages, I'll just look at it before this meeting. No, you need to spend days on that and thinking of that. There's a great sort of addendum, or kind of a read along or of cliff notes that goes with it. It's called Evolutionary Epistemology, and it's written by one of his collaborators by the name of Chuck Spinney. There you go. Yeah, you have it right there. I will tell you, I read Destruction and Creation 1,000,000 times and still would walk away getting some of the basics, but scratching my head, until I read the Chuck Spinney piece and went through that. And he's all over YouTube, by the way. You can find him everywhere on YouTube talking about that.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
No, and I can't agree more about how dense the PDF is. I think I spent about an hour just on each page, and it is incredibly dense, but incredibly eye-opening.
I'll tell you that I have a notebook filled like a moleskin notebook just on destruction and creation. I basically rewrote it line by line, but with ideas and thoughts around sort of what Spinney's talking about to understand it. Because as you say, it's the shortest paper, yet it's probably the heaviest paper you're ever going to read. It's the shortest, heaviest paper you're ever going to read. No question.
Yeah, I mean, given that some of the elements involved in the paper and given that he came from the quote unquote West, did he spend time studying concepts and thoughts from other cultures and the quote unquote East? Or
Yeah.
let me rephrase it, the quote unquote non-West?
Yes. So if you look at the, so if you go back to that diagram, I'm sorry. Yeah. If you go to that and you look at page 4 and you see that there's the depiction right there. That's what destruction and create. That's basically his, Linux kernel, if you will, right? Everything flows from destruction and creation. What's missing on that particular graph, there's a revised version of it. I'll flip it to you right now and you can put it up. It addresses exactly what you said. Essentially what it does is that last part where you see science and math, what you could do is add another arrow and we call it Eastern philosophy. And that was really the final input. What he was really good at, what he was really into was, you mentioned the multidisciplinary aspect. So studying the Book of Five Rings by Musashi, studying Zen. One of his favorite books was the Zen of motorcycle maintenance. That's a book that he read that's on his list. I don't know if you got it. You can post up what I just sent it to you, but it's an amendment to that particular graphic that shows that Eastern philosophy was a massive influence on John Boyd. So he wasn't, and I'll tell you, that's another massive edge for people that learn more about this and seek more information on this and really try to know more about it and understand more about it, is that differentiation alone is massive. So, John Boyd was all about Sun Tzu. He was very critical of Clausewitz. He was very critical of things like firepower, concentrated firepower, and other things. He was more aligned with the Sun Tzu mantra that every battle is won or lost before it's fought. And you could probably do a lot more with a lot less battle and a lot less firepower if you can control and have effect in the mental and moral phases of conflict. Like there's a book. So in the book by Robert Quorum, it talks about how John Boyd described the difference between Sun Tzu. Is Sun Tzu, you unravel your opponent and which basically drives them bananas. That's his term. And then whereas Clausewitz was like you're fighting and you're implementing firepower without being driven bananas, or made to be crazy. So
psychological warfare.
Yeah, psychological warfare. It all. So, I mean, I think that leads to a really big thing. It's all about mindset, right? It's all mindset, back to orientation. How you view things is mindset, and it's in a differentiated mindset can be an extremely powerful thing in the arena of combat. I think it's everything.
Okay. Now, I know in my limited experience with OODA loop, or at least definitely limited vis-a-vis yours, John Boyd was known to make a distinction between generalists, and I think he took issue with either analyst or specialist. Can you kind of expound a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And why he had the particular view that he had?
John Boyd thought that analysis was akin to in the Boyd book by Quorum. He used the term onanistic, and if you of course I had to look up that word years ago to see what it meant, but it's a mental mentally pleasuring yourself, if you will. That's what he considered analysis to be, because breaking things down is one thing, and then you notice the other, it's in orientation. Analysis is one thing, but it's the induction that we have. It's not the deduction alone, it's the induction that we have to synthesize something new that didn't exist. So if we merely analyze and we don't synthesize to create a new reality, we're no good. He rejected the term analysis. He rejected the term, analyst. He rejected the term expert. I don't know that he ever read Buckminster Fuller, but I think that my bet would be that John Boyd would agree with Buckminster Fuller's quote that all specialists rather would be replaced by automation in the future. But he was very much a generalist. And look at the canons that he pulled from to come up with his theory. It came from every discipline, all walks of life. He studied art, philosophy, history, literature, in addition to engineering, science, chemistry, physics, everything.
So he had a very famous example that he would ask people how to synthesize something new from 3 disparate parts.
Yeah.
I think it'd be illustrative.
It's I know. So it's 4. If you advance on in the piece that you have pulled up, you're going to see a couple of different things. There's a page that says, "What is a pyramid?" And it kind of that kind of connects to what we were talking about earlier. You know, if I only look at something from one perspective, all I see is a triangle. All I see is a square. Right there. So all I see is a triangle. All I see is a square. But if I anticipate different perspectives, I realize that what I'm looking at is the bottom of a pyramid, not a square. Or I'm going to operate as if I'm looking at the bottom of, as if I'm looking at a square, but I'm going to be open to the fact that it could also be looking at the bottom of a pyramid. In other words, our model was smashed, or we're anticipating that we could be wrong. I want to be flexible in case of a contingency. And if you go a little bit further, you're going to see another thing that he talked about, how he described analysis and synthesis. A few more pages forward, what he would do was, and I've done this with people in exercises, like there you go, right there. So you have 4 domains, right? You have a skier on the slope. You have a, what is it? A toy tank, and you have a bicycle, and you have a boat with, is the green one, as I say, boat with an outboard motor.
Speedboat.
Yeah, speedboat, right? And all of those domains, if you will, right? All of those things have nothing to do with each other. You know, a speedboat has nothing to do with a skier on the slopes. You know, a bicycle has nothing to do with a speedboat, or a toy tank has nothing to do with a skier on the slopes, or whatever. But keep going further. So what we have to do, we have to analyze that, and then we have to break all of those down to their component parts, right? And you start to isolate the component parts. Now, that page right there, what you've done there is you've taken away all the domains, all the things that define those parts as their previous whole are gone. Now you're left with all those bits and pieces of what he called the sea of anarchy. And that's in Destruction and Creation. So as you look at those parts and you scan through those parts that came from 4 domains that weren't connected in any way, shape, or form. Now I've shattered those domains. I've shattered that reality, and I'm seeking to build something novel. Keep going. I will get rid of the boxes, right? That's the thing we talk about. Think outside the box. You've heard that term. John Boyd said, get rid of the box altogether. So I've gotten rid of the box. I'm left with all these pieces. And as I have analyzed those, I seek to synthesize. Does any new reality emerge? And as you keep going through that, you start stirring up those components, and it comes up with a seat and handlebars and an outboard motor and treads and skis, and he makes a new reality. And his famous example was snowmobile. And his definition of a winner versus a loser: a winner is someone that could make a snowmobile. A loser is someone that could just analyze everything. You know, somebody had in the questions, how do you overcome analysis paralysis? This is how you do it. You synthesize. You understand synthesis. You understand what you have to do beyond analysis. You have to synthesize a new reality that didn't currently exist. And that's the answer to that one question there. So that's what you got to do. You break down realities, and then you see there's a caution. you could also come up with something not ideal, not optimal, right? But that comes through trial and error. That comes through learning. That comes through innovation. The first iPhone was a lot different than the current iPhone. The first iPhone was a lot different in the first year. I think they went through 3 or 4 different iterations just in the first year alone, because they're constantly breaking their models and changing, changing perspectives.
That's a fascinating example. I'm glad we walked through that, because tying it back to what we were talking about financial markets, it's about breaking down those sort of preconceived notions to understand where kind of like the groupthink is and where the opportunity really is when you actually kind of cut across sort of that perspective. One of the questions that came in from the community is, I'm just going to read it verbatim. How do you overcome analysis paralysis? I find myself spending so much time trying to see all angles, I fence it and miss the optimal move.
Yeah, I saw that question. That was what I was saying. I mean, you have to synthesize. You have to master synthesis. You have to be open to synthesis. You have to take whatever it is that you've analyzed, whatever it is that you've deduced, and come up with a novel new reality. That's how you get over that. A lot of people can't do that. We've all encountered people like that can analyze something and they just can't. They're frozen. They can't do anything because they don't have the ability to synthesize something that didn't previously exist. So,
but would the flip side, that's the exact other extreme, be equally dangerous? That making just decisions without having any sort of analysis behind them?
No, but that's why in the graphic he says you have to have both working in coordination. You can't just have one. It's the bottom. It's either the top. It's the far right or the bottom right. But it's the one in like the top right quadrant of the star, or whatever the right there analysis. No, they have to work together. There's nothing wrong with being an analyst if you're also a good synthesist. If you're merely an analyst, you're not going to be able to see a new reality. You're not going to be able to anticipate things that could be. You're only going to be stuck on what was. You're going to define things in terms of what was. Example, I look at an iPhone. I'm a Gen Xer. I know it was like when a family had a movie camera. I know what it was like when artists would go into a recording studio. I know what it was like to buy music in a store physically, right? And I explain to my teenage children that the iPhone replaces literally all of that stuff. They can't even imagine that, right? That's a synthesized new reality, right? We can break all that stuff down, and there's a new reality in iPhone. But like if I had a movie camera, and all the other things that a calendar. If I put it in 1985, if I put a movie camera, a calendar, a record player, a radio, a television set, whatever. If I put all that together and say one day all of this is going to be unified in a novel reality that doesn't currently exist and won't be defined by its pre-existing domains, everyone would think I'm nuts, right? But Steve Jobs felt that way, or the designers at Apple thought that, right? Because they were able to have really masterful synthesis beyond the analysis to come up with something novel that didn't currently exist, that aligned with what either people wanted or what people were open to consuming, because they saw a new reality that they wanted to do. So anyway.
Well, no, you actually just sparked a question in my mind just now with that example. Is if would there be an argument to be had that, let's call it, science fiction writers, or at least just fiction writers in general, since they deal in sometimes in the fanciful, help move that sort of new synthesis forward? Because if we're talking about bringing all these things together in the iPhone, it kind of reminds me of, let's call it, the tricorder in Star Trek, or the Dick Tracy watch has in essence become the Apple Watch. So it seems that where at the time that they were introduced, they seemed fanciful, reality eventually caught up with them. So is there an element to be said that living in fiction to some extent can help with that synthesis exercise?
I wouldn't disagree with that, because imagination and creativity are part of this too. You see in the evolutionary epistemology document, there's a whole page on creativity. I mean, that's critical. Yeah. So what we imagine, what we dream up, absolutely. That's inside one's orientation. That's a massive part. You have to be imaginative you're trying to anticipate something that doesn't currently exist or something that's never happened before. You have to have the imagination to be able to think that. It's not, everything most often than not is determined in previous existing models, and that's this whole point. We have to shatter those, and we have to be open to new potentialities because we don't know what we don't know what we don't know. If you go further in that document too, he talks about how Newton fused together theories from Ptolemy or others who thought that the sun was the center of the universe, or who thought that the Earth was flat or whatever. I mean, all of these things change over time. We have to be open to that, crazy, something that seems crazy at the moment, but to your point, could be transformed into a new reality when doing this stuff effectively.
So for anyone that wants to integrate the OODA loop more centrally into their sort of daily life, or at least approach to markets or to anything in general, would it also be recommended to broaden the sort of the literature or TV or radio or podcast that like the genres and type of what they consume? Because if that all helps feed imagination, you can get that spark of inspiration from just about anywhere.
Yeah.
So if we're only saying, let's say, going back to the example you said, just reading CNN, but instead of just saying reading CNN, then New York Times, and then foreign newspapers and other Twitter and some other things, but also consuming, let's say, a history podcast or a science fiction show.
Go to
Would
an
that
art
also help
museum.
people broaden their horizon and make them more open to an OODA loop, or rather, more open to an effective OODA loop?
Yeah. I was speaking to a group yesterday. We were talking about art. They're like, this only applies to business and war. I was like, no, it applies to art, sports, anything. Anywhere you have humans making decisions and actions, which is everywhere, you could apply these theories. They're universal. One of my favorite orientation books is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. He's an author. And the book, The War of Art, is all about how do we overcome resistance? How do we shatter our models? Or how do we fight the things internally that are going to impede our free and independent action? In other words, that are going to slow our OODA loop down in the long run. That's a tremendous book. That's widely read. But yeah, art is a good place to think. Certainly music. You look at the innovations in music and music technology, and different explorations and that, think of the 60s. I like to think of, like, say, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, or Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, these were radical ideas that changed the way people consumed music or thought about music, So, there's lots of, literally everything humans are doing, you can apply this to, but there's lots of analogies to use that are beyond business and warfare and that kind of thing.
Okay. That's definitely very good food for thought for everyone listening. I know they're running close to being out of time. The last question I saw from the community, I don't know, I'm not sure I understand it, but I'm going to throw it out here in case you understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any perspectives on this from Black and Brown contemporaries? I'm assuming Black and Brown are authors or psychologists, given that in the context from which this question was pulled, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure exactly what the question is. If you get it, great. If not, then we can just unfortunately have to take a rain check on answering that one.
Well, I mean, if you look at the epistemology of the OODA loop, that diagram, the one that I sent you, not the one inside the spinny one. I mean, I don't want to assume I know what they're asking, but I would guess.
Yes, it is to gauge other perspectives. It seems that they are other, I think, psychologists, or that's my assumption.
But Black and Brown meaning not Caucasian or European?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you go back to that theory of conflict, science, math page, the one Not the one from the the addendum one that includes Eastern philosophy, but even that one, I mean,
I don't have that one as a link that I can easily pull up here right now.
Yeah, I mean, Sun Tzu's from China, Genghis Khan was Mongolian, Mao, Chinese, Eastern philosophy, Musashi was from Japan, the Toyota production system, which came from Japanese industrial theorists. That was something that John Boyd was very much about. He of all the strategists I think that he probably pulled from Asia more than any other of his contemporaries. I don't know if Che Guevara, and he talks about Che Guevara. They were showing basically guerrilla warfare was something that he studied a lot of, and he read Mao's book and Guevara's book. Vo Nguyen Giap from Vietnam read his book. Certainly, like the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, like Lawrence's experience in the Arabian Peninsula, and so like he was somebody that would pull from anywhere. I think when he joined the military, remember the military was segregated. He joined during World War II, and the military U.S. military wasn't integrated anyway until 1948, and a lot of other things weren't, I guess integrated fully for many years. But John Boyd as a person, I don't think is someone that he was open to any opinion no matter where it came from, and I think that's a really good question, because there are a lot of these theories, and I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like John Boyd, is because he took a lot from the Eastern way of thinking. It's very counter to sort of the Western, American, European experience. It's a very different perspective.
So unsurprisingly, he was misunderstood and maligned, just like almost anyone that has a great idea.
Yeah, and there's a lot. I mean, so there's that, right? There's just being so radical and different. He was ostracized in his own lifetime. He got no credit for any of this while he was living. Most of this has come after he passed away in 1997. If you read the book, I mean, he was not the model man. I mean, he was a terrible husband, an even worse father. He was almost exclusively dedicated to his work, which maybe he would have been better off had he not been married and was like a monk, because he was at times in his life he was extremely monastic. You almost when you read through the biography, it's such a beautiful mind with the theoretical concepts that he came up with. But just you read about his life and his family, and you just pity. It's really sad. Like, it's really, really, really sad story. Like, it just was not he was not a good man. I've heard him described in interviews. They said, not a good husband, even worse father. He's no one what you would want for your father or your husband. And the book is very clear about that. And he was, if you didn't agree with him either, I mean, he was, I don't know. I've read about, I've heard that like Steve Jobs was like this too, I guess, but like, these kind of minds, maybe, I don't know. The personality traits, some of his personality traits were just abhorrent. He would gnaw his fingernails down. He would extinguish cigars in somebody's chest that he wouldn't like right in their necktie. He was vulgar. He used vulgar language continuously. So he's not he's nobody you'd want to bring home and hang out with necessarily, unless you were going to study this stuff and talk about it.
Basically, you're painting a picture of the quintessential tortured genius. Could
be. Yeah, there must be a book about that I need to find, but it could be. It's not, like I said, it's not a lot. A lot of the stuff is very sad. I mean, in the epilogue, I just grabbed it off the shelf. I'll just read this is from the Robert Coram book. It says, John Richard Boyd, as often the case with men of great accomplishment, gave his work far greater priority than he did his family. That the part of his legacy that concerns his family is embarrassing and shameful. I mean, that's that's the first line of the epilogue. It's really sad. But and he also too, like he I keep using the word monastic, but he believed that you either have to have all the money in the world or reduce your needs to zero. If you reduce the needs to zero, then you could be totally free. So he only lived on his military pension. They lived in the same little tiny apartment. His cars were all dilapidated wrecks. He didn't buy clothes. Any free money he had was all spent on books. And he wouldn't even have a case for his glasses. He carried them around the sock. So I mean, he was just a wild, just a very off-putting person. And if you weren't in his circle, then watch out.
Fair enough. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much for your time today and for joining us for what I thought was a very illuminating session. As we close out, I'm going to give the community a few minutes to see if there are any other questions. But again, I would really like to thank you once again for joining us and helping me bring the OODA loop alive for the community.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so I'm going to go once again say thank you very much. Thank you to all our listeners, and I hope that everyone learned something. I know I did. And on that note, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.